in the future on our website, and I will plug that website for you at the end of today's call so that you know where to find this call, as well as all of our past calls are recorded and posted there. So that is the layout for today. We're thinking the conversation, the actual presentation piece, will be approximately 30 minutes or so. After that, really allowing for that good amount of time for that question and answer period. So as I said, please put any of the questions into the chat, and we will make sure that we get those answered for you. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome a Mr. Trevor Youdale. Thank you so much, Trevor. Here you go.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. So this is an issue or an aspect of information management that I've dealt with for many, many years through the 2000s. As a records analyst within ministries, as a trainer, as a records officer, and continuing right through to today. And had a lot of personal experience with dealing with things left behind, let's say. So we're going to cover off different aspects of what happens when an employee is about to depart, ideally what should happen, and of course what comes after. So we're focusing on corporate memory. I guess it's another way to talk about the risk of forgetting or losing information or lost opportunities to capture information prior to the person walking out the door or transferring to another department, branch, or ministry or organization for that matter. So we're going to talk about records management aspects, resources, stories. We have some stories, and we also just have a lot of listings and suggestions, techniques, and methodologies. So half an hour, it's quite a mixed bag of content, so we'll move on. So we've talked about the topic, and of course this can be a very big issue for those looking at a retirement date or a transfer date. What do I do with the stuff that I've received or created? So moving on, so we're going to provide some advice on records management and related activities you can carry out around records. We are talking about all recorded information, including electronic and paper records. We do want to stress that government records are government's property, and so we have a caretaker responsibility, if you like, towards those records, including the email in your inbox. All records are subject to information schedules, so one of the tools we have is to understand those schedules, including the transitory record schedule and the disposition rules that they give us. We might have documented processes. There are checklists we're going to point you towards. We're going to talk about planning for the departure strategies tools, and also recognize that this is a highly situational issue, and there are broader considerations. So in terms of the records themselves, what are we trying to do? We want branches, program areas, and government to have records that they can trust, rely upon. We want the records to be complete. One of the risks of people leaving is that there are holes left in the story, which can really compromise a number of program areas and requirements, simply incomplete decisions or unable to make decisions, or records not being usable because they're not, for example, well described. You might have branch-specific procedures, which is a good thing. We have government procedures, and you might have established record-keeping systems which will provide you a framework and an ability to understand where you might want to capture the information, whether it's a paper file folder, a land drive, trim, or other. There are requirements to manage information according to information schedules. We want our record keeping to result in a cost-effective and efficient program. So are the records left in a manner that's well organized and understandable so retrieval is not compromised after the departure? We do want to support timely and defensible destruction of records eligible for destruction, and a common example are convenience copies of information being destroyed under the transitory record schedule. So we want to follow schedules. Okay, looking at a broader consideration of the issue, there are things like access, business continuity, the part that you are part of the public service, and ultimately our job is to serve British Columbians, and we need to meet other requirements like transparency. And we want to set up our successors for success. Okay, so there are other factors you do have to consider. What is the situation? Is it a situation where someone is leaving quite quickly? Is it something that's able to be planned for over the long time, for example, a retirement? You don't have unlimited time and resources, so you might have to prioritize the work and focus on the particularly valuable or sensitive information that you have control over. What kind of business are you in? Is it a case file oriented business or something else? Are systems easily available to you? A well-organized shared drive. What is the culture of the office? Does the office generally support taking the time to organize your information? What is the history of the office? Are there competing values and so forth? So what is the context that will influence how well information is treated leading up to a departure? Okay. So, of course, the flip side is there's a lot of risk around not working towards good records. You can compromise the ability to access the records. You might inadvertently lose information because its value was not recognized, and that might be through misclassification or misunderstanding. Certainly the creator or receiver of the information is probably the world's best expert on making those determinations with the support of others, including GRS. There are requirements under FOIPA and litigation, so you need to be conscious of, for example, what's going on in the environment in terms of access requests and litigation. Decision support. Will you leave a set of records that support subsequent decisions or make them difficult? Okay, so moving on. So in thinking about the presentation today, there was one particular morning where we had some network issues, and whereas I had planned to sit down and review materials online and email some people, I grabbed a pen and paper and I walked around the office and interviewed my colleagues, my peers, on what they would talk about in this kind of session. And what comes to mind when you ask the question, what issues or concerns have you seen around departure or transferring? So this is really a list of what people wanted to talk about, and in some cases quite passionately. Email, not surprisingly, is at the top of many people's list, and PST files. Just a note, PST files are usually quite problematic. They can be really a process of dumping records and putting them aside and creating all sorts of access issues. Personal drives, the fact that there might be government records caught on those personal drives and the need to move them off. The issue of what is your legacy, which I really appreciate because it adds a positive lens on the staff who are departing and what could their contribution be in terms of knowledge transfer and information that they leave behind. In the training realm, we've often seen people coming along to training because they're being given a project to clean up other people's stuff left behind. And I've dealt with this in the past, the boxes in the basement, the boxes at the end of the hall situation that are poorly understood, poorly described. One of my favorite examples is an organization that was closed, and where I was at the time, we got a call from the last person standing. They had 45 boxes, and the lease was about to expire, and they wondered, what do we do with these 45 boxes of program records? So we had them moved into another location, and not surprisingly, half the boxes contained things like staplers and unused binders. So it was supplies and records, and the records were a mess. So we had to spend time going through those. So what gets left behind? Is it well organized, or is it a mess? There's the issue of pushback or contributing. So what is the reception to the idea that some effort should be put into organizing the records, and being mindful a person might be under stress or overwhelmed by the amount of work, or disengaging even. So what's a response to the request that they spend time putting their records in order? And I would argue, as much as possible, you would want to frame this as that it's a way to contribute, that your work is valuable, and we recognize its value, and we want to ensure that we capture that value through good records practices. The other thing is supervisor's responsibilities. I would argue that the supervisor of the departing or transferring employee is the person with most agency to influence the outcome. So it's really important for supervisors to appreciate their role in good practices through this process. Planning is critical. So as much as possible, this should be a managed, planned process. So where time permits, you should have a plan. And I would argue that involves scheduling certain activities that we'll talk about in a moment. There is a possibility that non-records get mixed in, and that just makes it more difficult to identify the value, separating the wheat from the chaff. And we do have to recognize individual behaviors over time, and possibly quite idiosyncratic behaviors that you will need to deal with. Okay, so some resources for you. If you have a look on the BCPSA website, there's a whole area around leaving the public service. It does include an employee checklist. I encourage you to use that checklist. Have a read of it, and make sure that you employ it. Our organization also has produced a departing employees guide. Some of the content of today is pulled off of that, and it's also referenced on the PSA website that mentioned in the first bullet point. The framework is also your organization. What are the tools in place? What procedures your branch or division might have in place, and you yourself. What's your knowledge base? What's your skill set that comes into play? Okay, so here's a screenshot of the PSA website. You will notice over on the right some links to some procedures, and right in the middle there is the employee exit checklist, which uses the term housekeeping, which I think is a really good term. I would say keep in mind housekeeping, record keeping, housekeeping are two highly related terms, and I think that is a positive way to think about the work in hand. And then there's Government Records Services website, records management guides and training, and right down in the bottom half you'll see the Departing Employees Guide. Its proper title is actually Departing and Transferring Employees, and I'd encourage you to use that as a tool. Taking that to another level, I would start thinking about that in terms of onboarding. So when someone comes into your branch, what expectations do you set around how they manage their information as they start to create it and receive it? Certainly if you're talking about a short-term situation like an auxiliary or a TA or some form of secondment, I think you need to manage that process with a view of what information ought to be captured prior to the end of that term. So let's talk about some practical things. I'll just check the time because it does fly. Have a plan. So schedule some work. Based on your understanding of the records and where those records are being created on a LAN, in email, on a SharePoint site, flash drives and whatnot, have a plan and identify where they may need work and time to organize, clean up, and hand over that information. So plan that in advance as far as possible. It's not unreasonable for a career public servant who's looking at retiring in 6 months to start planning now. There's a huge aspect of this which is knowledge transfer. So employees have knowledge of the recorded information, its nature and where it is. There's also, there's tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge that you have to think about. So some approaches are to create some sort of record of how that information is organized. You might want to do a deep dive in the form of an interview to get a richer contextual understanding of the information and really what is it that you should really be paying attention to. So you've got to look everywhere, all locations, and think about this as an organizing, sorting, cleanup process. You want to certainly be classifying and capturing information into your office record-keeping system. There might be certain information for current matters to hand off to the successor, and there might be another category of information you just want disposed of. And I'm really thinking of the transitory material that could be noise to the person coming along after, and certainly you want to make it easier for the successor to understand what is of value and not have them go through the material and try to make those determinations. Certainly separating out personal information is key, and some sort of organization and labeling. If it's a last-minute matter, sometimes it's enough just to sit down and get a quick overview of where, for example, the project material is. In the physical world, you might have a pad of stickies, and you actually label the information in a quick session. So something's better than nothing in unplanned situations. Oh, and by the way, again, this information is very much based on the GRS Departing Employees Guide, so I encourage you to read it. Okay, some examples. I got this one off Bev. The phrase Bob's Boxes is something I think a lot of us can relate to. You'll see there in that first bullet point, PST folders. I think of PST folders as the villain in our story. They're generally frowned upon, and they are difficult things. So as a supervisor, I'd encourage you to encourage people to avoid PST folders in most cases. And so we've just got some examples here right through to floppy drives. And that last point, I think, is another aspect of this is information can be quite atomized also. So sometimes you have to broaden out your thinking as to where the information has pooled in the organization. Okay. Another good example that was conveyed or relayed to me last week was in the Ministry of Agriculture. There was a program called the Extension Service Material. So I think of this as the Cadillac version of departing employees. we had a career public servant who was greatly familiar with a program called the Extension Service in Agriculture, and they had knowledge of hundreds of films that were acquired by the ministry over a substantial period of time. And this person, in fact, was involved in the program for decades. So the reason we've got this example here is that there was a project prior to that person's departure to review the material, to work with an archivist to establish a criteria upon which the records could be selected for long-term preservation in the archives. So this is a case where there was a large volume of high-value records or potentially high-value records, and the subject matter expert was there, and there was a specific project to go through that material and identify what is of value. So this is not typical, and we're not suggesting that we have a SWAT team of archivists sitting around waiting for the phone to ring, but it's really to illustrate the value of doing this work prior to departure. So on that note, here is the BC Archives collection entry of those records, the Ministry of Agriculture Films, 1928 to 1981. And to make it a little more real, one of the films was about a Canadian champion barrel racer, so I was actually able to find a photo on the BC Museum or Cowboy Museum of Fame. So the point here is there are consequences to how you handle departure. In some cases, they can be quite significant and have an ongoing value for British Columbians. Okay, how are we doing? 11:25. Okay, some other examples. This is getting to more common or relatable examples for most of us. The first one might be about ensuring that the email and documentation is identified and filed into EDRMS or TRIM, as you might know it. So that's having time to go through the email, destroy the transitory email, and file the valuable email. In the case of a paper environment, going back to that sorting process I talked about earlier, going through the documents and identifying what should be caught in the record-keeping system and what should be placed in the secure shredding bin. The third point, again, is going to the issue of knowledge management. Having some sort of interview, it might be more than one interview as the process moves along, to ensure that you know where the valuable stuff is. The next bullet point is that idea that in ministries we have highly specialized, long-serving public servants who accumulate a lot of knowledge and information over the course of their career. And so that might be an opportunity where you've got this specialized person. If there's a fair degree of autonomy in their role, they might have idiosyncratic organizational methods, but you really want to engage that individual formally as much as possible. There's even the suggestion that you make it a project through my performance, so you're really recognizing the value that they had for the organization before they leave. Of course, it's all even better if you have a very mature records program where most of the information is well managed as things moved along and there's little to do at the end. Okay, I was thinking about how to illustrate this, and so here's one example. These are search screen shots from TRIM, and the idea here in the first one is that, let's say I retired today, and I was good about saving my information into TRIM. My successor next week could go into Trim and run a search. And that search could be, what did Trevor Youdale create in Trim in the last 12 months? It could be the last 6 months, it could be the last 3 years. But the point is, if they could rely upon the fact that I'd consistently saved records into Trim, including email, PowerPoint slides, Excel spreadsheets, they could do that broad sweep in Trim and say, okay, what did this person create? Another version of this on the right-hand side would be, okay, if they're looking for email correspondence between 2 individuals in the last 6 months, so what did Trevor Youdale and Bev Kwalitza create in terms of email messages that might have been saved in Trim in the previous 6 months? So that might be where you're really looking for a needle in a haystack. But the point is, if you can say, in this branch, this individual usually filed their content into Trim, including email, then the next person who comes along is in a position to run searches which might pull back the information thereafter. Okay, so we're on to our guest speaker. And we're pretty much on time. It's 10:30. So Bev's coming over. And Bev has been a senior trainer in our organization and is now a records officer. So I'm just going to switch out seats and Bev's going to talk a little bit about her perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Trevor. In Trevor's little foray around the office on the day when all systems were down, we had a great chat just about the whole subject around Bob's boxes, which he mentioned earlier. So in the last 4 years, I worked as a trainer across BC. So I had the opportunity to work in big cities, and I had the opportunity to work in a lot of smaller organizations within small towns as well. And when you train as many people as I did over a period of 4 years, you begin to really see common themes. A very common theme in any room when I was teaching were people who had been, for lack of a better word, saddled with a bunch of information. We sort of affectionately began to call the scenario Bob's boxes. So apologies to any real Bob out there. It's not personal. So essentially what I saw over and over again were folks who usually in 2 scenarios, either a brand new person into government or into a ministry who is perhaps the successor to someone who had left or retired. That person was saddled with, they moved into the cubicle or the office, and along with that came a bunch of information, a bunch of boxes. Often being new to the role, we've all been there. We know what that feels like. It's challenging enough within itself to have to go through someone else's stuff and try to understand how they worked, what they were doing, how they were organizing themselves or not organizing themselves, and try to capture the information that had value and then weed through and get rid of the stuff that had no value is a very challenging, daunting task that really any new employee should not be saddled with. The second scenario that we commonly saw was where Bob's boxes kind of traveled around the office. They kind of became an entity unto themselves. They occupied different hallways, different cubicles, different closets, sometimes basements, all kinds of things. I even heard of once boxes in the back of a van in the parking lot. So there are all kinds of variations. and generally speaking, they would eventually find their way to an administrative staff who perhaps had a little bit of knowledge or maybe even extensive knowledge on records management. However, this puts that person in a position of having to go through records that they weren't the creator of. They are not the subject matter expert on those records, and they're having to make decisions around material that could potentially be valuable with really not enough support to be able to do that in a confident and efficient way. So that was just a snippet of what we saw. In any room of 20 people, there were usually a couple of hands that went up who were dealing with this situation, and this was on a repeated basis over 4 years. In my personal opinion, we should have moved beyond that at this point. As managers and supervisors in government, we have a responsibility to ensure that our staff are managing their information when they leave. We have that responsibility as individuals who are paid by government as employees as well. The second example I can kind of share with you is an organization that I went into who were really, for lack of a better description, I think it's fair to say, they were really aggressively trying to share or trying to create a records management program for the entire organization. They were unique in that they happened to have a large space available to them to look at potentially storing their information. So they hauled in a very large number, I think around 800 boxes from offsite storage, with the intent to go through them, examine them, and that sort of thing. So again, this isn't exactly the same scenario as Bob's boxes, but what I'm trying to communicate here is what they discovered is when they went through those 800 boxes, they were left with about 400, with a very huge percentage of that 400 boxes contained things that were left by employees who were hightailing it out of the organization for one reason or another. So staplers, shoes, desk supplies, folks who just didn't know what to do with the stuff that they were working with, so they put it in boxes, and then the organization was paying for that. So it's, again, a bit of a variation on Bob's boxes, but the principle still applies. When we leave, we need to deal with our stuff. If I could leave you with one last little plug, one of the things that Trevor mentioned as well was PST folders. I like to create a visual around a PST folder for you. When you archive or create a PST folder, it's a little bit like asking the BC government to rent you a storage space, like one of those garage type units, storage that you pay on a monthly basis. They make TV shows, you know, people go in and empty a storage container to see what they can find. That sort of a storage wars, I think it's called. So imagine when you create a PST folder, you're kind of essentially asking the government to rent you a storage container. The problem with storage containers is at the end of the day, somebody has to clean them out. So if you have been really good with a PST folder and only put in valuable information, then you know that information has a place that it has to be classified. However, if you've created PST folders full of transitory and official information, you now have a mess to weed through at the end of your career or at the end of your work time in the BC government. So my plug there is remember, storage space costs money, costs the government money. Archiving folders really locks down information and doesn't make it accessible over the course of time. So that's about all I have to say on that subject. Feel free to contact me anytime if you have any questions and you want someone to speak to this. I would be happy to do that.
Great. Okay, so I'm back for the wrap-up. We have some questions. Let's see. Two of the question was, well, where is some of this information? Sorry, no, Elizabeth? Okay. So we did post some links in the messaging panel. Where is the Departing Employees Guide is linked there, as well as where do you find information around accessing the BC archives, and there's a link there to their web page. British Columbians can call up the archives or go down and make a time to access the materials there. It's for you, it's for British Columbians, and so I'd encourage you to use that resource. And of course you can do searches online as well. So Google the archives. The Departing Employee Guide, it's off our records management website. You know, you can find our website if you just Google arts and orcs. You might get certain kinds of orcs from movie and film world, but you'll get arts and orcs, and that's the website, and you'll see a whole section for guides, including the Departing Employee Guides, guides around transitory records, guides around email. We've got a lot of stuff online, so check it out. Okay.
So I'm just squishing beside Trevor. We've had a few other questions that have come in, and I'm just wanting to read those out loud for everybody on the call. The first question is, can transferring employees take email with them?
Sure. There is no, to my understanding, there's no corporate policy. It does depend on the ministry, and it does depend on the program area. So it's a conversation you would want to have with your director. I think at the end of the day, it is the decision of your program area by senior management as to what might go. Of course, records of the program relating to the program should probably stay with the program, and you do want to be mindful of sensitive and personal information as well. You don't want to create a breach or a incident out of good intentions. So this is a conversation you need to have with your management, and there might be extenuating circumstances, but generally don't take your email.
The next question that we received is, how can I encourage better practices for records management in my office?
Okay, so this could be a number of things. I think influencing and planning is critical here. So some options that come to mind is if there is in the recent past where a problem came up, Bob's Boxes, or as a perpetual problem, I think you should bring it to your management. You can bring it to your record staff, your immediate supervisor. It's something you could talk about in a staff meeting. You could address it through the lens of how do we manage knowledge in our organization? What are our processes? Do we consistently use checks, lists, and processes to mitigate risk? So I think it's very much about raising attention, talking about it in meetings, responding to specific incidents or perceived risk. If there's something out there on the horizon you're really concerned about, let's say Bob's about to retire and you know no one's talked to him about his knowledge, you might want to bring it up. So I'd say talk and ask questions and persuade. Okay.
The next question that we received is saying, does IAO still conduct records training for groups, or is this only through the Learning Center?
Oh, okay. So, does IAO? Well, GRS used to be part of IAO, so I could interpret that question in a few different ways. But yes, so Government Records Service has an active and growing training program. You should check out our website. I think it's linked in the message part of the screen. So yeah, we've got a growing program. We're focusing more on shifting to, well, we have a plan that we're developing to increase our focus with online content, but we still do classroom training. Our courses and information are listed in the Learning Center. You should check out our website. We even have an area on our intranet that explains, well, based on your role, here are the courses that we offer that you might be interested. So we have lots out there for you. Okay.
So it's looking like that's the last of the questions. We'll give it one more minute for any questions to come through, just in case there's any last minute ones. But I have a few other things to show you, so I'll switch slides.
Sure. Okay, bye.
Great. So first, I just want to say thank you so much to Trevor and to Beverly for coming and talking about that today. You can see there's definitely some passion based on their past experience and working with our ministries and our clients and trying to really get a wrap on preserving that memory before people walk out the door. And I'd like to point out as well, like Trevor had stated, it's not just when someone's leaving your organization, but oftentimes people changing positions within your organization, that is something that needs to be considered as before you're leaving one team and moving to the next, dealing with those records and leaving that memory where it needs to be. So, to continue on with a couple of the questions that we were asked, one was definitely around resources. As we stated, the links are in the chat. I put a link specifically for where to find the Departing Employees Guide, the BC Archives, as well as our training website. So I just want to pull up the two of them because we like to have that shown. If you are going to our website, like Trevor said, the easiest way, search just ARCS online, and you'll come right to our site. Along the left-hand side, there are some links. The link that you're looking for is the one right here that says Records Management Guides and Training. Underneath of that, you will then scroll down, and then you will notice here the Departing Employees Guide. And so this is a really nice addition into what Trevor and Beverly had talked about, that this is something you can just print out and really even give to somebody that's going to be walking away, or just let them know that that's there as a resource. As you can see, there's several other resources on here, that one specifically to do with today's topic. The second link that we added, and I will plug it a little bit here, is our new training website. This is an intranet site, so you do have to have an IDER to have access to it. But if you are to go through and to find this with that link, it's also available on my signature when I send those emails out. Underneath of the first portion, you'll see Community of Practice sitting here. This is where we actually have a link to all of the past Community of Practice calls that we've hosted. Like I stated, today's call is recorded. My commitment to you is by end of day tomorrow, where it has today's session, you'll then see a link to this call and you'll be able to view it, as well as a list of what our upcoming sessions are. So funny mentioning IAO, information access, operations there, being a part of our overall organization, just a different branch. Next month, our topic is actually going to be getting to know CIRMO. CIRMO being our division, Corporate Information and Records Management Office, and all of the branches within that. Really the who are we and what do we do and how can we help you, what do we have to offer. Our guest speaker will be Roxanne Weeds, and giving that message on behalf of all of the different branches. If you look below, you will see there is a way for you to follow kind of a screenshotted example of finding the link to this call and the phone number for this call. I know I emailed a couple of people so that they could get on today, but going forward, if you do go there, you can find all of the links and information on your own as well. Trevor alluded to this portion of the website, and it's really breaking down based on the duties and responsibilities that you have in your role, what training we would suggest. So as an example, if you open it up, you can see the courses we offer, whether they are online or in the classroom. We are trying to put more and more of our content online, recording sessions, creating interactive e-learning. It's a very large focus for our training team over the coming months, so continue to keep an eye out here for the latest and greatest of what we have to offer. And then lastly, you'll see the upcoming sessions, and this upcoming sessions, if we do have an in-class session session that's hosted in Victoria currently. That will list what the sessions are and also, again, how you can sign up for them. Conveniently, if you can find this site, there happens to be a link over to the site that has the departing employees on it, as well as the training team's email. So feel free to use all of those resources. If there's any questions about training, always email our generic email. The team of 3 of us, 1 of us will get back to you promptly, is our commitment. As my final wrap-up, no other questions came in. I will just say, again, next month's topic, it is always the first Thursday of every month. I'm trying to keep it consistent. So first Thursday of every month at 11 o'clock is when the Community of Practice calls will be hosted. I want to say thank you to all of you out there. We're seeing our membership, let's call it, in our Community of Practice continuing to grow. So through word of mouth, we're seeing that volume and hopefully being able to get messages like this, departing employees, to help all of us that are left behind in an organization to be able to deal with our records. So thank you so much for being a part of today. Feel free to reach out afterwards and have a great rest of your day. Take care.